Greetings all, D&Disability here, taking a break from my academic look at disability and instead taking a brief look at monsters, monstrosity, why we use monsters, how to play them, and more importantly, how to kind of reclaim them and separate them from some of their problematic nature. So why monsters and monstrosity? Well, as many of us would agree, and as Professor Timothy Shutt of Kenyon College would agree, that monstrosity in some ways is at the center of the epic. And really, why does the epic matter? Well, the epic matters because it is the source. Works such as Beowulf, the Iliad, the Odyssey are kind of the fundamental source and inspiration for many of the tabletop role-playing games, kind of role-playing game myth that we engage with. We engage with monsters directly out of those fantasies, whether it's the Hydra, the Manticore, or the Cyclops, just to name a few, not to mention the Minotaur and others. Monstrosity is not without its problems, right, or its detractors. Figures such as Stang and Trammell, who wrote the Ludic Bestiary, state that monsters, of course, are a reflection of human attitudes, beliefs, and female monsters continue to reproduce the hegemonic attitudes and hate towards women that society has engendered through its patriarchy. The hag, in their example, is kind of a quintessential example of this use of monsters to make women seem more monstrous, and their overall argument is that we should stop doing this. Now, that's not to say that I agree with this argument, but it's a front realization, and one I wanted to lead with, that the actions we take as players and as dungeon masters really kind of reinforce some of these societal norms that we don't even think about. They are just so kind of grained within us. To transition over to a work by Halifel, Monstrosity, Performance, and Race in Contemporary Culture, they state, and I quote here, "The technology of monstrosity is a dynamic tapestry reflecting a multitude of instructional producers and consumers' desires and fears. Ironically and predictably, these desires and fears are often one and the same. That is, that which we defile is at once that which we desire. In this way, monsters are constituted through excess, an excess effect located in the space where fear and desire interact with one another. Thus, all cultural performers, including you and me, everybody are intersecting culture's most monstrous desires and fears, even as we project them onto others and uncertain elsewheres." End quote. Now, Calafel is getting at here is this kind of idea that it's the tension of the monster. Monsters are effectively what society does not like, what society does not pose. Think about it. They're selfish, they're greedy, they're violent, they typically either need to be expelled or are living that way because they've been expelled, or they need to be destroyed. And Dungeons & Dragons fundamentally is a game about destroying monsters. So when we consider role-playing monsters as DMs and even as characters, we need to consider how this environment, the de facto nature of monsters as being other, as being an alien member of society, not going to be accepted, and what those representations mean, inherently should color our performance of them. From Frumma Zeitlin, we get the Closet of Masks, role-playing, and myth-making, the Orestes of Euripides. And the myth-making discussed by Zeitlin places the role of myth-making in between this kind of formal and formless category that defines an almost Levi-Straussian bundle of constructs approach to examination. Zeitlin states that myth cannot be viewed in Levi-Straussian terms as simply a bundle of constructs and relations, but rather as a province of an individual poet who is actively involved in the business of literature with all that implied. The genre of myth generated, in the case of Zeitlin, dictates the nature of the myth's metamorphosis. The teller of the story inherently interacts with and changes aspects of the myth, and this is what he calls the act of mythopoesis. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, Zeitlin's contribution to this point goes even further, as Turner points out in the self-reflexive tabletop role-playing game, a work I've referenced before, which is that the act of play is a mimesis within a mimesis. that is to say, a reflexive act that sees the enactment of play, and in Zeitlin's case, and in RPG in Turner's case, is open to self-reflection and self-awareness by its very nature. This act of double mimesis is not viable within the text of an RPG, but shows itself in the act of playing the game. For those following along, this is the act of playing a monster. So what are we doing when we play monsters? It's the same as when we do when we play characters. We are mimicking the things we see around us in typically comical or exaggerated or monstrous ways. This does not mean that we shouldn't do this. What it means is that we need to be mindful of this and consider what we're stereotyping, who we're stereotyping, etc. And how we can adjust that to avoid causing offense, to avoid producing more of these societal problematic behaviors that have done things like, I don't know, perpetuate misogyny for the past several hundred years. The monster, like Jung's child god, is a universal element of heroic fiction and tabletop role-playing games. Whether the monster is human, non-human, subhuman, divine, ultimately makes little difference in their binary role in opposition to the protagonist. Valentina Serangelo states that the mythopoetic founders always draw on the same archetypal material stored in the collective unconscious, not differently from every artist and creator of any age. One of these universal elements surfaces in Serangelo's essay, the aspect of the child god and its relation to the RPG Elder Scrolls lore. This recycling of elements, as Stang and Trammell have also pointed out, is inevitable unless a conscious effort is made to alter or avoid them. However, the universalization is unavoidable regardless, as the superficial traits cited by Stang, Trammell, etc. intersect with the lower level of the Jungian pyramid, the culturally specific, not the upper level of the human universal. That is to say, the ugly, the old, the scary depictions of the hag discussed by Stang and Trammell are representative of Page's thoughts on myth. Quoting from them directly here, mythos forever shadows thinking, demanding that we attend to it in its irreducible indecidability. This quote from Spitzer, while grappling with the role of the mythos in philosophy, can be turned toward a deeper understanding of myth in RPGs, and when considered within Stang and Trammell's arguments about the Jungian theory of Serangelo. Mythos, like Jung's archetypes, shadows what game creators and participants interact with both consciously and unconsciously. That myth and its kind of bundle of corresponding traits should be considered as an inevitable that shadows the very act of fictional creation. Yet these acts of creation are entirely dictated by what is a given source, such as a rulebook, states. Rather, the games enable the opportunities for change that Stang and Trammell wish to occur. So we have feminist authorship, such as Stang and Trammell, begging for us to stop using female monsters, right? To stop using monsters also depicted in this kind of hegemonic, pejorative kind of way. And I think we can roleplay monsters, and we can roleplay hags, and we can roleplay mermaids and naiads and dryads and harpies and other kind of female forms, but we can do it respectfully. And we can also acknowledge through the actions of other female characters in our settings, and this is my big point with today's lecture, that the female monstrosity that we're demonstrating in the case of playing female monsters, right, can be offset by the positive actions or positive portrayal of women in RPG contexts. So what I'm saying is for every mean, nasty hag, harpy, whatever you throw in, consider making another NPC have a positive influence or be a positive representation of that figure. This can go for creatures that, say, represent blindness, deafness, mutism, or other forms of physical disability as well. So if you have a creature that's entirely blind, such as Grimlocks, as an example, they often have their own kind of primitive civilizations. They're shown as these monstrous blind humanoids, right? Then consider having maybe a blind researcher as an NPC that's interested in studying them and kind of how they they do things. Or consider having them as a kind of positive representation of blindness, because even then they can demonstrate that as blind monsters, they are not incapable of creation. When role-playing monsters, let's consider that A, we're depicting our views of real people through acts of monstrosity. We are depicting the othered in society, and the fundamental core idea is to be in some way battling or combating these kind of ideas. They don't have to be intractable problems. They don't need to be always met with violent solutions. It's also okay, and I'm here to say this, it is okay to play monsters as truly awful or monstrous beings, as long as you are doing the legwork with other parts of your setting to demonstrate that you're referring to just this kind of monstrous creature and not men as a whole or women as a whole or blind people as a whole, right? It's worth to do that little bit of extra work to not just include the disabled, but include the dismantling of gendered norms that come with monstrosity and stereotypes that come with monstrosity inherently in these games. All right, so this has been a quick video instead of my weekly upload on my thesis, which I've been previously going through. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. Remember, we can play monsters, we can do it convincingly. It's just a matter of doing it respectfully. And if you want a kind of ways that I play my monsters sort of video, let me know down in the comments and I might make a follow-up to this one. Thanks, guys.